The rain hammered against the apartment windows as David Martinez stared at his phone screen, his hands trembling slightly. The message was clear, devastating in its simplicity. "We need to talk. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. Come alone." It was from Sarah, his wife of 8 years, but something about the tone felt wrong, distant. David had noticed the changes in Sarah over the past few months. She would disappear for hours without explanation, her phone constantly buzzing with messages she would quickly hide. When he asked about her day, her answers became vague, evasive. The woman who once shared everything with him had become a stranger living in their home. The warehouse district was nearly abandoned at this hour, streetlights casting long shadows between the empty buildings. David's footsteps echoed against the wet pavement as he approached the address Sarah had given him. The building loomed before him, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rust. Sarah stood in the center of the vast space, but she wasn't alone. A tall man with dark hair stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. David's heart stopped. "Sarah?" His voice cracked as he called out to her. She turned, and for a moment, David saw a flicker of the woman he had married, but it was quickly replaced by something cold, determined. "David, I'm sorry you had to find out this way." The man stepped forward, extending his hand with a cruel smile. "I'm Marcus. Sarah's told me so much about you." David ignored the outstretched hand, his eyes fixed on his wife. "How long?" "6 months," Sarah replied without hesitation. "It started innocent enough. But Marcus understood me in ways you never could." The words hit David like physical blows. 6 months, half a year of lies, of pretending to love him while she was with another man. He thought of all the nights she had come home late, claiming to work overtime, all the weekend business trips. That now seemed like elaborate deceptions. Why? The question came out as barely a whisper. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but Marcus squeezed her shoulder, and her resolve hardened again. "Because you were never really there, David, even. When you were in the same room, you were somewhere else entirely." David wanted to argue to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Was she right? Had he been so consumed with work, with his own problems, that he had failed to see his marriage crumbling? "I want a divorce," Sarah continued, her voice steady and final. "Marcus and I are moving to Chicago next week. I've already spoken to a lawyer." The warehouse seemed to spin around David. Everything he had built, everything he thought was real, was dissolving before his eyes. "You can't just leave. Like this, we can work through this. Couples therapy, whatever it takes." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the empty space. "She's made her choice, David. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Something snapped inside David. The rage that had been building for months finally found its target. He lunged forward, but Marcus was ready. The two men grappled, their bodies slamming against the concrete floor. Sarah screamed, begging them to stop, but David couldn't hear her anymore. All he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, loud and frantic in his ears. Marcus was stronger, younger. He managed to pin David to the ground, his hands around David's throat. "You're pathetic," he hissed. "No wonder she came to me." David's vision began to blur, but he managed to grab a piece of broken concrete. With the last of his strength, he brought it down on Marcus's head. The man collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. Sarah's screams filled the warehouse. She knelt beside Marcus, frantically checking for a pulse. "You killed him!" she sobbed. "David, what have you done?" David stared at his hands, covered in blood and dust. What had he done? This wasn't him. He wasn't a violent man, but the evidence was there, undeniable. "We have to call the police," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "No?" David's voice was surprisingly calm. "Help me move the body. Are you insane?" Sarah backed away from him. "I'm not going to help you cover up a murder." "You will," David said, stepping toward her, "because you're as guilty as I am. You brought him here. You destroyed our marriage. This is your fault too." Sarah's eyes widened with fear. This wasn't the man she had married. This wasn't the gentle, quiet David she had once loved. "David, please, let's just call the police and explain what happened." It was self-defense. But David wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about the warehouse, about how isolated it was, about how no one would find the body for weeks, maybe months, about how he could make this all disappear. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. David forced Sarah to help him wrap Marcus's body and load it into the trunk of his car. She cried the entire time, begging him to reconsider, but David felt strangely detached from it all, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold. They drove to a remote construction site outside the city, where David had once worked on a project. The foundations were still being laid, deep holes that would soon be filled with concrete. It was perfect. As they buried the body, Sarah made one last plea. "David, this isn't you. You're a good man. We can still make this right." David looked at her, dirt and blood on her clothes, tears streaming down her face. "It's too late for that. Now, we're in this together." The weeks that followed were a nightmare of paranoia and guilt. David expected a knock on the door at any moment, police coming to arrest him for murder, but no one came. Marcus had been a drifter, Sarah explained. With no family to miss him, his disappearance would likely go unnoticed, but Sarah couldn't handle the guilt. She began drinking heavily, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound. She would sit in their living room for hours, staring at nothing, occasionally muttering apologies to someone who wasn't there. "You need help," David told her one morning, finding her passed out on the couch with an empty bottle beside her. "We both need help," she replied, her voice hollow. "What we did, it's eating us alive." David wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but he couldn't, because he was changing too. The guilt was transforming him into someone he didn't recognize. He found himself checking the locks obsessively, looking over his shoulder constantly, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The breaking point came 3 months later. Sarah had started talking about, confessing, about turning themselves in. She couldn't live with the secret anymore, she said. David knew he couldn't let that happen. They were arguing in the kitchen when Sarah grabbed a knife, not to attack him, but to threaten herself. "I can't do this anymore, David. I'm going to tell them what we did." "You can't," David said, moving toward her carefully. "We've come too far. Look at us," Sarah sobbed. "Look what we've become. This isn't living. This is hell." David reached for the knife, and in the struggle that followed, it plunged deep into Sarah's chest. She looked at him with surprise, more than pain, blood spreading across her white blouse. "I'm sorry," David whispered as she collapsed. "I'm so sorry." But even as he held her dying body, David knew he wasn't really sorry. The relief he felt was overwhelming. No more paranoia, no more guilt, no more witness to his crime. He called 911, reporting a break-in gone wrong. The story was perfect. Sarah had surprised a burglar who had killed her in his panic to escape. David played the grieving husband perfectly, and the police bought every word. At the funeral, David stood beside Sarah's grave, accepting condolences from friends and family. Everyone spoke about what a loving couple they had been, how devoted David was to his wife. If only they knew the truth. But the truth was something David was learning to live with. He had discovered something about himself in that warehouse, something dark and powerful. He wasn't the weak, passive man Sarah had thought him to be. He was capable of anything. Months passed and David began to rebuild his life. He sold the house to many memories. He started dating again, meeting women online who were drawn to his mysterious, brooding persona. They didn't know about Sarah, about Marcus, about the darkness that lived inside him now. One evening, David met Alina at a downtown bar. She was beautiful, intelligent, with a laugh that reminded him of Sarah before everything went wrong. They talked for hours, and David felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine connection. Alina was recently divorced. She told him, still dealing with the betrayal of finding her husband with another woman. David listened sympathetically, sharing his own story of loss, carefully editing out the parts that would send him to prison. They began seeing each other regularly, and for a while, David allowed himself to believe that he could be normal again, that he could love someone without destroying them. Alina brought light into his life, made him remember what it felt like to be happy. But happiness, David was learning, was a dangerous thing for someone like him. It made him careless. Alina started noticing inconsistencies in his stories about Sarah. Why were there no photos of their wedding in his apartment? Why did he never want to visit her grave? When she pressed him for details about their life together, David's answers became vague, contradictory. "Are you hiding something from me?" Alina asked one night as they lay in bed. David's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. What would I be hiding? I don't know. It's just ... Sometimes I feel like you're not telling me the whole truth about your wife. David turned away from her, staring at the ceiling. How long before she started digging deeper? How long before she discovered what he was capable of? The thought that had been growing in the back of his mind finally crystallized. Alina was becoming a problem, just like Sarah had been a problem, just like Marcus had been a problem. David began planning carefully. He couldn't make the same mistakes he had made before. This time, it had to look completely accidental. Alina liked to hike alone in the mountains on weekends. A fall from a cliff, a tragic accident that claimed another beautiful life too soon. Opportunity came sooner than expected. Alina suggested they go camping together, just the two of them, in a remote area she knew well. David agreed eagerly, already mapping out the terrain in his mind. Looking for the perfect spot, they arrived at the campsite on Friday evening, the sun setting behind the mountains in shades of orange and red. Alina was excited, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about previous trips. David nodded and smiled, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating distances and drop-offs. That night, as they sat by the campfire, Alina brought up Sarah again. I've been thinking about what you said about your wife, about how she changed before she died. David tensed. What about it? It's just the way you describe her. It sounds like she might have been having an affair. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on their faces. David forced himself to remain calm. What makes you say that? The behavior you described, coming home late, being secretive with her phone, being distant, those are classic signs. Alina reached across and took his hand. I'm sorry, that must have been incredibly painful. David looked into her eyes, so full of compassion and understanding, and felt a moment of genuine regret for what he was about to do. But it passed quickly. Alina was getting too close to the truth. She had to be stopped. You're right, he said quietly. I think she was cheating on me. I just didn't want to admit it, even to myself. Alina squeezed his hand. I'm here for you, David. You don't have to carry that pain alone anymore. The next morning, they hiked to a scenic overlook Alina wanted to show him. The view was breathtaking. Miles of wilderness stretching out below them, with a sheer drop of at least 200 feet. Perfect. Alina was standing near the edge, taking photos with her phone when David made his move. He came up behind her quietly, his hands already reaching out to push her over the edge, but as he touched her shoulders, Alina spun around, and David found himself looking not at Alina, but at Sarah. His dead wife stood before him, her chest, still bearing the wound from the knife, blood staining her white blouse. Did you really think you could forget me so easily? Sarah asked, her voice carrying on the wind. David stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. You're dead. I watched you die, and whose fault was that? Marcus appeared beside Sarah, his head caved in from the blow David had delivered in the warehouse. You killed us both, David. Did you think we would just disappear? David looked around frantically. Alina was gone. The overlook was gone. He was standing in the warehouse again, surrounded by the ghosts of his victims. But there were more now, faces he didn't recognize, people he had hurt in ways he couldn't remember. This isn't real, David said, backing toward what he thought was the exit. You're not real. Neither are you, Sarah replied sadly. Not anymore. You died in that warehouse too, David. You just haven't accepted it yet. The walls of the warehouse began to dissolve, revealing the truth that David had been running from. There was no Alina. There was no new life. There was no escape from what he had done. David opened his eyes slowly, the bright fluorescent lights making him squint. A woman in scrubs was standing beside his bed, checking his IV drip. The room was white and sterile, with thick windows that didn't open and doors that locked from the outside. Good morning, David, the nurse said gently. How are you feeling today? David tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The nurse helped him sip some water before he could find his voice. Where am I? You're at the Riverside Psychiatric Facility, she explained. You've been here for 3 years now. I'm sorry I couldn't visit yesterday. We had a family emergency, and I had to stay home with my daughter. The memories came flooding back. Real memories this time. The breakdown, the hospitalization, the diagnosis, the medication that kept the voices at bay but couldn't silence them completely. The family, David whispered, fear creeping into his voice. Do you still see them, the ones who were betraying you?" The nurse's expression grew concerned. She made a note on his chart before answering. "David, you know there was no family. The delusions were part of your illness. Sarah, Marcus, Alina, they were all manifestations of your schizophrenia." David closed his eyes, trying to hold on to the fading fragments of the world he had constructed in his mind. The warehouse, the betrayal, the murders, it had all felt so real. More real than this sterile room, more real than the medication that dulled his thoughts and made everything seem distant and gray. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" the nurse asked gently. David nodded slowly. "I understand." But even as he said the words, he could feel the other world calling to him, the world where he was powerful instead of broken, where he was the victim instead of the patient. The nurse smiled and patted his hand. "That's good, David. The doctors will be pleased to hear you're having a clear day. Maybe we can try reducing your medication again soon." But David wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about the warehouse, about Sarah and Marcus, about the life that had felt more real than reality itself. As the nurse left the room, David closed his eyes and let himself drift back into the shadows of his mind, where the truth was whatever he needed it to be. In the hallway outside, the nurse made another note in David Martinez's file. Patient continues to experience elaborate delusions involving infidelity and murder. Recommend maintaining current medication levels and continued observation. Patient may be a danger to himself and others if delusions persist. She closed the file and moved on to her next patient, unaware that David was already planning his return. To the warehouse, to the world where he was David Martinez the victim, not David Martinez the patient. Where love could turn to betrayal, betrayal to violence, and violence to a kind of terrible, twisted justice. Because sometimes the lies we tell ourselves are the only truth we can bear to live with.